So I want to thank you all for coming this evening, and I am really excited actually to be able to present some of the material that we present in the Shamans Siddhas class that I teach with Robert Thurman. And in that class, we're looking at the way in which shamanic practice and Buddhist practice are different and the way in which they're similar. And one of the things that we actually don't look at in that class is how they come together in depth hypnosis. And we are going to talk a little bit about how depth hypnosis incorporates the wisdom of both these very ancient and powerful wisdom systems. But first of all, I'd like to define each of them and then talk about the similarities that they share and the differences that they don't share. And then I'll talk about where the intersections come together in depth hypnosis, particularly around the use of power. So the similarities between Buddhism and shamanism begin with the fact that they are both very ancient wisdom systems, as I said. And shamanism is a practice that you find in almost all indigenous cultures. In fact, more than 95% of the cultures that have ever been on the planet have shamanism as their core process of doctoring, ministering, problem solving, healing, divining. And you find this arising all across the globe. And the interesting thing about shamanic practice is that shamanic practice is quite similar in the different cultural settings that it arises in. Buddhism is also a very ancient wisdom system, and the current form of Buddhism that is practiced here in the West now, it's come to us from India. It arose in India in around 550 BC with the birth of Indian prince who became known as Buddha. Buddha means the awakened one. And this wisdom system actually comes out of the roots of an even more ancient set of wisdom systems, including Vedic science, Hinduism, and a form of very similar practice that is perhaps even 17,000 years old, according to that particular tradition. So these are very, very ancient wisdom systems, and they both focus on understanding power, and they focus on understanding the way in which power moves, both within the self and around the self. And another thing they share in common is the way that they use ritual and initiation as part of the processes of developing the ability to be able to focus power and to be able to use power. And another similarity is that they also work with subtle energies. And this is particularly true with Tantric Buddhism, and that's where we're going to be focusing primarily this evening, where you have this focus on understanding light, understanding sound, and understanding the elements and how each of those different processes, those different elements, light, sound, and the elements themselves. And when I say elements, I'm talking about fire, water, earth, and air, how all of those are used in deepening understanding about more subtle ways of knowing. So those are the primary similarities that you find with Buddhism and shamanism. And the differences are actually kind of profound also. One of the big differences that you find between Buddhism and shamanism is that in shamanism, the practitioners of shamanic practice who are generally dedicated to the service of the community. They are trying to understand the nature of the unseen power of the earth. They're working with the elements to develop that understanding. They're working with light and sound to help create healing processes where their service to the community is most strongly felt, which is almost always in healing, almost always in divining, almost always in problem solving and doctoring in general. So they're working with they're working with these powers that they're accessing, which again are the unseen powers of the earth, and they're focusing it into the affairs of humans in a community kind of way. With Buddhism, the use of that power is generally dedicated to the enlightenment and liberation of the individual. And the processes of understanding power and the processes of understanding these unseen energies are dedicated to helping the individual move out of a state of suffering and into a state of liberation. And that movement from suffering to liberation is actually a process of understanding the nature of the self and nature of reality. And so you have this difference where you have the dedication to the individual liberation in Buddhist practice, and the dedication to the liberation from suffering for the community in shamanic practice. Then you have, as another difference, you have in shamanic practice, the shamanic practitioner who is perceiving these powers that are emerging from this unseen world that both the shamanic practitioner and the Buddhist practitioner are focused on. The shaman, when the shaman perceives these powers, the shaman is perceiving these powers as arising from outside the self. So you have the power of the tree, of the unseen power of the tree. You have the unseen power of the mountain. You have the unseen power of the lake. These are all powers that are held outside of the self and held within the natural realm. In Buddhism, you have these phenomenon that are arising within the self, the different lights, the perception of the different pure lights, the perception of the different levels of subtle energy bodies. These are all perceived as arising from within the self. And there is not this concept of something separate outside the self that you find with shamanic practice. And this accounts for another difference. This is the basis for another difference that you find between the two practices, which is that the shamanic practitioner is generally focused on understanding what is happening in the natural world and what is happening here, and what in shamanism is called the middle world, and what in Buddhism is called the mundane world. This is the middle world is one of the three worlds that shamanic practice elucidates: the upper world, the middle world, and the lower world. And there, of course, you can see the parallel there between the sky, the earth, and the world beneath the ground in terms of the natural world. And the shamanic practitioners are always seeking to understand the unseen powers behind the landscape, behind the sky, and behind what is beneath the earth. And in Buddhist practice, the Buddhist practitioner is trying to understand something even beyond that. There's this focus on what is called the ground luminosity, trying to understand the nature of this very subtle place where all phenomenon is emanating from. And there's a much more theoretical approach to understanding this ground luminosity, and there's a much more dedicated study to the world beyond physical forms. And there's an effort to try to understand this larger matrix that all physical forms are emerging out of, that you don't necessarily find in shamanic practice, where there's this focus on the physical forms and on the unseen properties behind the physical forms. So one of the places where I find the shamanic practice and the Buddhist practice coming together is, and where they each inform the other and each make the other stronger, is in this understanding about the nature of power. In shamanic practice, as I said, there tends to be this focus on mundane events and working in the mundane world. And when you have that kind of a focus, you also have the possibility of having people who are interested in all types of power, not just universal power, and trying to figure out how to use that universal power for the benefit of all the people they're serving. You can also have people who get interested in power over, that is the more common definition of power in worldly affairs, where one person has power over another. And one of the issues with shamanic practice is that there can be a degeneration in practice because of this. There's a kind of lack of discipline in understanding the different qualities of power, and there's actually not the emphasis on integrity that you find of course, I'm not saying you can't say this is true across the board, but one of the reasons that shamanic practice sometimes goes astray, where you have people that are practicing in a less helpful way, is because there isn't this emphasis on morality. And in Buddhism, of course, there's a tremendous emphasis on finding one's integrity, developing the right view, developing the right use of one's effort, developing a true understanding of the nature of compassion, developing a true understanding of the nature of generosity. And there's also this discipline of practice that you find in Buddhism that is not always found in shamanic practice, where you have a daily practice where you are moving from one level of realization to another through that daily practice. And in shamanism, when you're practicing the journey or you're working with the journey, you're generally, shamanic practitioners are just seeking to gain power, to bring more power into their lives, to be able to have access to more power. And there's not necessarily this emphasis on self-development through that power. But in Buddhism, there's definitely this emphasis on self-development. So you have, in shamanic practice, you do have an excellent set of vehicles in terms of healing, which provide the movement of power from one place to another to help people heal. And those processes are processes like soul retrieval or power retrieval. But in Buddhism, you don't have a lot of catalytic process. It is in Tantra, you do, but not in the more devotional areas of practice where people tend to focus in Buddhism. So you have, if you bring those two together, if you bring the discipline, the emphasis on integrity, if you bring the catalytic power of the shamanic practice, if you bring those together, you can have a very powerful process of self-transformation that depth hypnosis actually seeks to capture. And there's a very important aspect of depth hypnosis along these lines that is important to understand, which is the use of the shamanic journey within the processes of depth hypnosis. Again, in traditional shamanic practice, the shamanic journey is used to gather power by the practitioner. The development of a relationship with the guide or the teacher that emerges in the shamanic journey in the form of nature is a relationship that is used primarily, again, to focus power into the community members. It's not necessarily used as a vehicle of self-transformation the way that it's used in depth hypnosis. And the processes of self-transformation are the ones that you usually find in the deeper practices of meditation, moving into the deeper levels of shamatha practice and moving into the deeper levels of vipassana practice. So in vipassana, you have this is sometimes called insight meditation because it's a meditation process that helps bring insight into the aspects of the self which are not necessarily accessed without the meditative focus. So when you're working with the catalytic processes of the journey and you're working with the self-transformation processes of the Vipassana process, and you bring those together in depth hypnosis, you have pretty much an unstoppable vehicle for enlightenment, actually, and the transformation of karmic patterns, the relief of suffering, the deepening of understanding of where one's suffering comes from, and the ability to actually transform that suffering in a very quick and catalytic way. And for those of you that have had any kind of contact with depth hypnosis, you have probably discovered that things do move rather quickly. And I really think it's because of this unique way of working with the journey that we work with in depth hypnosis and in applied shamanism, where we are working with the journey in the way that Buddhists work with Vipassana meditation to create a development of the self that is disciplined, focused, and ever deepening. So that's my lecture for this evening. I'd really appreciate it if you have any questions, if you have any comments. I'd really be interested to, if you need any clarifications. This is a very quick lecture. Again, I haven't gone deeply into any of these aspects. I'm just kind of making a very broad brush here, and I apologize if I've made any kind of too broad brush a stroke and used too much of a generalization or a stereotype. I certainly didn't mean to do that. I'm just trying to capture broad points so that we have a basis of comparison and understanding of these two very powerful wisdom systems that we are so lucky to have access to in this time and space. You know, that they're both on the planet, that we can both study them both in the same place and learn from both of them and be able to weave their power into a process that supports all of us. So if anyone has any questions, please let me know. Yeah.
It seems to me that shamanism can lead to a destructive path where if the practitioner itself wants to gain more and more power, which can be corrupting. So in having Buddhism in there, that forms a container of, say, morality or something like that, which counteracts the corruption of power. Can you expand a little bit more on that?
Well, so for instance, in Buddhism, the study of power, you know, when I was talking about elements and light and sound being something that is held in common, the study of those three things being in common with shamanism, the study of those three things are really held in Tantra or Vajrayana practice. And those practices are outgrowths of Mahayana Buddhism, which is more common in, the Vajrayana and the Tantrayana practices are more common in the Himalayan regions. And in that process, in those schools, there is a very deliberate set of initiations that one has to go through in order to be able to access the information. And you even have beings called Dharma protectors that are these sort of ferocious manifestations of compassion that are designed to face down any kind of negative intention arising from within the practitioner in terms of a desire for power that might be out of alignment. And there are processes for working with those Dharma protectors to transform any kind of imbalance in one's intentionality toward power. And these practices are very much prescribed. Now, in traditional shamanic settings, you also have processes of initiation, but there's not the emphasis on developing a kind of morality or integrity around power. The idea is to be able to just hold more power. Like the initiation is designed to help you be able to hold greater and greater amounts of power, have greater and greater contact with teachers and guides that would make you a more powerful diviner, a more powerful doctor, that sort of thing. And one of the things that happens in shamanic practice, and it's completely understandable, and you see this in multiple cultures, it's not just one culture where you see it, shamans are often charged with doing the impossible. And actually, shamans can do things that seem impossible with the intercession of this universal power that they are able to direct if they are in balance with themselves. But a lot of times, you can't stop the drought. You can't make the disease go away. You can't make the neighboring tribes stop warring with you. And so you might try to use the universal power that you have access to with a particular intentionality or a particular attachment to outcome that may not be in everyone's highest good, right? And this is where, you get this idea of spell casting coming in, or this idea of trying to create obstacles for whatever the process is at hand that is perceived as being threatening to the group. Like there may be some kind of negative intention sent toward a negative intention sent toward a neighboring group of people so that they won't harm you. You're sort of doing the best defense is the offense. And so you kind of get this kind of warfare that shamans are known to engage in, and on a non-material level happening. And it starts out probably with a good intention, but it ends up being just like other human interactions that are not informed by compassion and kindness. But the problem is they've got all this power at their hand. And then you have this degeneration in practice, which is really unfortunate. And that's why a lot of shamanic practice has a bad name in the modern times. People are afraid of it because of this thing does happen. And one of the things about applied shamanism is that because we combine it with so much of the Buddhist emphasis on discipline and morality, that cannot happen within applied shamanism. So, yeah.
So, thanks. I have a couple of questions about power itself. So, in its truest form, is power simply catalyzed energy? And if not, what is it? That's one question. Okay. And then we talk sometimes about negative power. And I wonder, does power itself have a negative charge, or is it actually neutral and metabolized by intention?
Yes. Well, I think it's really important to put definitions, and I really appreciate your asking that question. When I'm referring to power, I'm referring to universal power, and universal power in its essence from, all shamanic practitioners will tell you when they access universal power, it's compassionate in nature, it's wise, it's generous, it's tolerant. There's this, expansion that you find in it. And of course, this is also the definition of the enlightened state that the Buddhist practice is trying to access, right? So when we're talking about power, we are talking about this universal power in these definitions. And what I'm talking about, and I'm not sure everyone in the whole world would say this or understand this, but what I'm referring to with power is this universal power, which is compassionate as a basis, right? So then in terms of energy, I think about energy in terms of a step down of that universal power that goes through different prisms of different types of forms. And so you have humans using universal power through their own prisms, and that prism can generally move through their intentionality, their motivation, and their will. And again, out of no fault of, we'll start out with no fault of their own. People are trying to keep themselves safe. They're trying to, make sure that bad things don't happen. And so they use universal power to try to keep themselves safe, right? But then they start seeing other people as threats, and then they start using the negative intention toward other people. And then pretty much you have this energy being informed by intention. And when you said, is negative energy is negative intention just a sort of process of moving energy in a particular way? Yes, there's this universal power comes into the human form, gets processed through the human structures on an energetic level, both conceptually, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. And we start setting intention with that energy on a mental level and on an emotional level, and we start working with that energy, and we have these energy exchanges that then begin to form all the kinds of relationships that we have with other people, right? So I think I answered your question. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for this talk, Isa. I want to go back to something you said earlier about the catalytic power available in shamanism from the natural environment. And I was just curious, on the path to enlightenment, if you think about that path in Buddhism and the process of vipassana meditation and so on, I'm just curious if the reason why that process may not be as catalytic, say, as using the shamanic process to perhaps work through similar karmic patterns working towards enlightenment. Is the difference perhaps that as humans with all of our karmic baggage, perhaps, that we're not as able to access universal power or the ground luminosity because we have these sort of filters on ourselves in the Vipassana meditation process? Or can you say a little bit more about that distinction between the two?
Well, definitely one of the reasons why we don't perceive the ground luminosity within us, which in Buddhism is often called Buddha nature. It's this aspect of ourselves that is connected with the ground luminosity in a kind of unbroken way. And from a Dzogchen practice idea, which Dzogchen is a further practice in the Nyingma and the Bön tradition, you have them very well developed, where it's understood that at the heart of everything that is manifesting around us is this ground luminosity, and the task in that practice is to be aware of that ground luminosity at the same time that you're aware of all of the forms that are kind of cocooning it and hiding it, right? Unless you perceive it, right? And most of us do not perceive that ground luminosity, or we're not aware of our own Buddha nature, particularly because of not only our own karma, but the processes of karma creation of the culture, which, in this culture, although we're quite secular in nature, there is this strong idea from some of the spiritual traditions that inform the culture that we are born in sin, that we are sinners, that we are somehow fundamentally flawed, right? And in Buddhism, there's a completely different idea that we are fundamentally full of light. We are fundamentally connected to the divine in an unbroken way. And the only reason that we can't see it is because of the karmic patterns, the ideas, in ways that we've cycled emotion away from Buddha nature, away in an effort to try to, again, protect ourselves, gain power over others, any number of intentionalities that are not geared toward the common good, right? So the more you circulate energy with your thoughts and with your emotions in these places where you are not moving toward the nature of Buddha nature, compassion, generosity, and wisdom, the more obscured the Buddha nature becomes, right? So in terms of Vipassana meditation, again, is this process of going inward. And it's generally this, there's generally a first set of meditative practices that you have to practice in order to be able to effectively use your mind in Vipassana, which are the meditative practices of shamatha, which is the practice of focusing your attention in a one-pointed way over time, so that you develop one-pointed focus and your mind is not distracted. And generally, that is done by helping you focus on your breath. You can focus on a flame, you can focus on a picture, you can focus on a set of words, but that will help your mind come to an even place. And then you can use the tremendous intelligence that is held in the conscious mind to go deeply into the self, to begin to look at different obscurations or obstacles that are thrown up by the karmic patterns, and to begin to open them with, again, that focused attention, and allowing them to allowing the Buddha nature that's at the heart of the obstacle to reveal itself. Now, all of that takes a ton of discipline, practice, focus, and you need a good teacher. And good teachers are not that easy to come by, actually, in that process. But again, the Vipassana is wonderful because the point of Vipassana is self-transformation. And when you dedicate the power of the journey and the catalytic power of shamanic healing to that process of self-transformation, you really do have a vehicle that is unstoppable. I mean, you cannot stop it. I mean, those of you that have taken depth hypnosis, you can't stop it, right? It doesn't stop. You wish it would. Sometimes I wish I could just go to the ball. I can't do it. We got to go to the mall, and then we see all this thing that's happening over there, and then what's that person doing? What am I doing? Sorry. I don't know if anybody else has that problem, but I definitely do. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. All right.
I have a question. It might have been answered a little bit when you talked about first saying that the West has a lot of self-loathing, and then you talked about some of the Christian teachings that we were born in sin. Is that part of our self-loathing? Is it different than that? And how does that relate to many Westerners now going to use the plants? Is that a way to get rid of the self-loathing? Because there's such an increase in people wanting to use, Westerners, the healing plants.
Yes, so there's a couple of different questions in there. Let me kind of take it level by level. So is this idea that we're born in sin the reason for the self-loathing? That's only one part of it, I think. The other part of it is, I have my first degree was in cultural anthropology, so I've been studying cultures for a long time and studying our culture in particular because it's so weird, there's something in this particular Western culture where there's this drive to succeed. You have to do it, and especially in America, you have to be independent, you have to manifest destiny, you have to make it. And there's a lot, especially in since the rise of media, where companies are trying to sell their products. If you don't have our product, you're not good enough, and people are buying that. So there's all this, and if you have our product, you will be good enough, and then they have their product and they still don't feel good enough, right? So there's this kind of layering of I'm not good enough, right? I'm not independent, I haven't made it, I don't have the material things I should have, and if I do, I don't feel good with them. So, I'm just not good enough. And there's this intense competitive edge in this culture, and everyone's always comparing themselves to everyone else. And you can find anybody who you compare badly to anytime, right? But you don't realize that they're probably comparing themselves to you and finding themselves coming up short, right? And everybody's looking at each other, thinking I'm less than you, and creating all this negativity, and trying to separate themselves off into this place where they can finally be safe, but nobody can ever be safe by doing that, because any place that they've withdrawn into is a place of either where they're trying to actually get away from themselves in the sense of wrongness, right? And what the plants do is they bring you into contact with yourself. And many people who have the thing that I have seen about the way that the plants work, and the good news is there are many places now that have many organizations that can legally work with many of the plants. The Union de Végétal won their court case at the Supreme Court that they're allowed to use ayahuasca legally as a sacrament. The Native American Church has peyote that they're allowed to use as a sacrament. And of course, in other countries, people are able to use these plants legally. And so, I work a lot with people who have been to other countries and have done these plants or have worked with them in these legal situations. And I've learned a lot by listening to the way that the plants meet people. And the plants are very much like the shamanic guides that people meet in journeys. And I always say, there's nothing you can't do with a plant that you can do with the shamanic journey. And that's because the guides meet in the same way the plant meets the individual in the place where they need to be met. And I have seen time and again, depending on the person, a person comes into contact with this field of compassionate energy that the plant presents to them. If they're in a particular place on their plant, they will resist it and have a very difficult time. If they're until they break and surrender to the plant. And this is where you have the throwing up, the diarrhea, all the tough, difficult kinds of experiences that people have with the plant. Other people may be all of that is needed to break down the resistance to love and to self-love, right? Some people have an immediate experience where that resistance is met, and you often find, like with ayahuasca, she's talking about the serpent, many people experience ayahuasca as a snake, the spirit of ayahuasca as a snake. And I was listening to one person the other day who was describing his experience with self-loathing and ayahuasca. And he said that the ayahuasca came to him in the form of a snake and wrapped itself around him in this warm embrace, and then came and looked at him in the face with just all this love radiating into his eyes. And he said he could feel all of his self-loathing dropping away, and being shat out, right? Because that's the purge of the plant. So he literally feel the self-loathing being pulled out of his cells and going out through his intestines. And, he didn't have the resistance, and that was a very quick path to self-love, right? But now he needs to integrate it. How does he hold it? How does he bring it into his life on a daily basis? You don't just go over to the plant and have the plant love you and then come back out here and think, oh God, I'm a piece of junk. I'm never going to make that job. I'm not going to get that interview, right? You have to have a practice. And this is where the shamanic journey comes in. Journey to that snake and go back to that snake daily. Feel that embrace. Ask, how do I integrate this embrace? How do I integrate this love into my life? Where else do I need to address this self-loathing that I haven't seen yet? How do I bring this wisdom into every single breath that I take? This is what we need to do. And but one of the things that'll happen is people will go do the plant, just do it, oh, I love myself, and then they go back into their life, and then they do harmful things to themselves, right? You really need to have an integrative practice, and this is why I think applied shamanism and the way we work with the journey is so helpful, right? Does that make sense? All right? Good? One more quick question.
Just curious if shamanic practitioners have any idea of, or words for the idea of karma.
No. No, you don't. You never see this when shamanic. I've never seen a shamanic practice that has this idea of karma. Although you do have shamanic practices that do believe in reincarnation, but this whole study of what impels a soul from incarnation to incarnation, and the study of the karmic paths that are taken from incarnation to incarnation, I have not seen that in shamanic practice. One of the big focuses of shamanic practice is to bring balance, is to bring wholeness, is to connect people with the power of the earth, right? But again, that imbalance is not necessarily perceived of as necessarily being karmic in nature. Or that concept of karma I haven't found in any shamanic tradition. And again, I haven't studied with every single shaman in every single tradition, and there may be traditions where that's more developed than others, but I'm not aware of them.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, thanks everyone for coming, and thank you, Isa, for.